So today we have Murilo Carvalho with Holstein Canada. He's an extension and education specialist joining us to kick the series off and talk to us about some maternal characteristics and how that relates to dairy heifer management. So I had the pleasure of meeting and working with Murilo through my grad studies at the University of Guelph, and we're super excited to have him here to share lots of really important insight and knowledge. So thank you, Murilo, and we will pass it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Casey, Betsy, and Lizzie. Pleasure to be here today. Good afternoon, everyone. Please feel free, questions, and as much as we can, we're going to try to answer everything. If you have any problem, please stop me, let me know if anything going on. And thanks again, you guys, for inviting, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm gonna share my screen with you so we can kick it off. Is everybody seeing my screen fine? If not, let me know, please.
Looks good, Murilo.
Good. So today we're gonna talk a little bit how a different way, let's say, to improve heifer performance from breeding through their first lactation. It's a little bit of the studies I did at the University of Guelph during my grad study time with Casey there. And I'd like to thank the Cornell University Co-op Extension team for having me today. As Casey said, I'm education extension specialist for Holstein Canada. I'm a vet by background, so have a little bit of knowledge on the vet side too. And please feel free to ask questions. And so just an outline what I'm gonna try to cover today, a little bit of a background where the idea comes from, where this topic comes from, and the maternal and early life physiological, metabolic, and stress effects on the phenotype, on the performance, how to minimize the negative effects to improve performance, and some take-home messages. So to start, probably everyone has heard about epigenetics. Probably you didn't really know what it was. Some of you may know pretty well. But what is this? Basically, so every mating you have, half of the genetic material comes from each parent. So all of us, let's say half of our genetic, our DNA, comes from each of our parents. But once you have the fecundation, you have the two genetic components going together, and you start to develop an organism. The environment starts to play a role on that development. It's not only, today is a little bit cold. It's not just now that you have that environment, that the environment starts to play a role right from the start, from the developing of the organism. So basically the epigenetics is how the DNA interacts with the environment. So how, we have two animals that are exactly the same genetic component, but the environment plays a role on that. So if you take two clones and you put one in Alaska and the other one in Brazil in the heat, although they have exactly the same genetic composition, they'll probably perform very differently because of those interactions. And that's true for pretty much everything. You have several factors that can affect the genetic, how the DNA respond in terms help in terms of performance. So we're talking about nutrition, we're talking about housing, temperature, and so on. So pretty much everything can affect, or everything that's environmental related can affect how the animal perform and how affects the DNA of the animal. So kind of a little bit of a history on how that became relevant. In the first half of last century, some studies, they started to do some observational studies in Europe. And first they started looking at obese and obese people, what do they have in common or what they did not have in common. So basically, we know that it is really related to eating habits by the end of the day, but everybody knows someone that has trouble to gain weight, or someone that gains a lot of weight very easily. And so the idea was to try to understand like why one person gets more weight than the other, and why each one is the way they are. And they started to find some interesting patterns in terms of, how if their mom was a smoker or not, and like things like that, their mom had some disease or not. And that led to a very interesting study, pretty famous in the 70s. So they looked on the consequence to the women and men that were exposed in early life, or their mothers were exposed to the Dutch famine during the end of the Second World War. So basically, Germany had blocked Netherlands, so there were no supplies going to the country. So there's a huge shortage of food. So a lot of people suffer from that. So they interestingly observed that the kids that were born by that time that suffered with that famine, and the kids that were born just after their parents, their mom in this case, passed through that food shortage period. These kids had the daughter, the ones that were in early life, and the daughters and sons, they had some difference in terms of development. So they observed that they had more obesity, they had more diabetes, more cardiovascular disease, and they started to wonder, like, why is that happening? So why the maternal factor affects the kids? And that led to more research, the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. They tried to understand a little bit better which factors could affect, which maternal factor could affect the next generation, maybe even early life factors could affect it in the long term. So they started to look at like health aspects. For example, you have here is an illustration of a glucose test, so related to diabetes and other metabolic factors. For example, the environment where the person lives and the mother used to live, at least. So for example, populations in very high altitude, like what the sons and daughters of those people have different from the rest of the population. And even some life stress factors, how do they play a role? And more specifically and especially food related things, like how different plans of nutrition would play a role. So they started looking, for example, a population in the northern Europe, they eat way more fish, and how that can play a role. And that they started to find some pretty interesting aspects in terms of long-term disease. So for example, the daughters and sons of obese people, they have more chance of being obese in the long term, and they had more chance of having cardiovascular disease. And with these observational studies in humans, they started to question, like, how is each thing affecting? So they started to work with lab animals that they have a shorter lifespan, and in the end, it led to some research in livestock as well. That's a little bit more recent. So the studies were mainly first in lab animals just because they have shorter lifespan. It's easier to control the environment. It's a very simple way to have a research model. And they started looking at different aspects such as metabolic parameters, body composition, body development, their growth, disease predisposition, longevity, fertility. And when thinking about specifically in cows or in livestock species, would talk about milk and component production, in beef cattle, their body composition, their meat yield. So specific for dairy cows would mostly be interested in milk and component production. That's where it all started, specifically in dairy cattle. But we know that it's hard to understand. It's hard to study this type of thing because this is cattle has a very long lifespan and so many environmental factors. And it's not like poultry that everything's controlled under the same environment. So basically, that's sort of a background, and I find it a little bit interesting because I think that affects us a lot. It's something that even humans and we somehow is interesting. And that was part of my master's thesis, that we knew that disease affect fertility in dairy cattle, but we didn't have that much details. A lot of people used to say that more uterine disease, such as RP and metritis, they would cause that a lower fertility once the animal was getting bred. But now we have studies showing that no matter the type of disease, if it's a uterine disease or not, there is some detrimental effect. And another factor was the timing. So that was pretty much what I'm showing here from my study, that we showed that no matter the timing, you see, it really takes a long time to see the negative effects of disease not show up anymore. So I basically looked at all the disease that occurred within 21 days in milk, and that's pretty much at least half of the disease in dairy. We know that they happen in the beginning of lactation, but they have a very long-term effect, say like 200, even 200 days in milk, almost 200 days later after that disease, there's still some impairment in fertility. And even if we're transferring an embryo, we knew that there's still a negative effect in fertility. So get an embryo from a healthy cow to a cow that had, and transfer to a cow that had disease, we still have negative effects. So we know that there's something going on in the uterus, right? There's something not letting those embryos develop and turn into a pregnancy. So then we wanted to understand what happens to these heifers that are actually born from cows that had some disease, and how that could affect. So basically the first idea, our first question was what happens to those calves? Like, yeah, they're born from a cow that had disease, that had lower fertility, but how do they develop? Do they develop normally or not? And we pretty much had no idea what we could find in terms of production, in terms of health and development. So what we did, we tried to compare 3 different groups. A group of heifers, daughters of heifers, of nulliparous heifers. They were never, was their first calving. We look at the daughters of lactating cows that were healthy, and we look at the daughters of lactating cows that had disease. So we looked at the maternal factors, and we follow these daughters through their first lactation, from birth until their first lactation. We looked at their health, reproduction, milk production, and how they were cold, they died, and what happened to them. Because we knew that already, that just the lactation itself has an effect on the embryo development, because the lactating cow, she's producing lots and demanding a lot of energy and lots of resource from her body. And normally we breed the cows by the time that they are producing the most. So that's a very challenging period. You probably have heard that female athletes, like very high level athletes, they have trouble getting pregnant. And that's pretty much similar to dairy cows. It's hard to make them pregnant. So what we observed was that the daughters of the heifers, the nulliparous heifers, they had a little bit lower fat yield. Even though they have a higher genetic potential, they had a lower fat yield in their first lactation. But you also find that the calves are lighter, which is expected. It's normal that the daughters from heifers, they're lighter. But it was interesting that they also had lower dystocia, which is probably associated with the lighter weight. And that kind of probably explain the lower fat yield. They're a little bit smaller animals. They develop maybe a little bit slower, or they don't develop as much their mammary glands, so they produce a little bit less. But it was very interesting that they had way less mortality, although they had the same amount of disease from birth to the end of their lactation. They had way lower mortality. So maybe maybe the stress of the lactation was enough to somehow impair the immune response. We're not super sure. It was more observational study. But that was our guess. And they also had a little bit better fertility. So they calved a little bit earlier, even though they started being bred at the same time, they calved in general 7 days earlier. And we're talking here about 800 heifers that we followed from birth to end of first lactation, just for daughters of nulliparous. Then when we compare the daughters of the sick cows, they actually had lower disease incidence, which was very interesting for us. So we're very confused by that. But at the same time, we found that they actually have way higher mortality. So they get sick less often, but the ones that get sick, they really get sick. They end up dying a lot of times, which we found particularly interesting. So maybe those heifers they're tougher. They kind of create a more resistance because they develop in a worse environment. But when they get sick, they really get sick, and they are not able to cope with that, and they end up dying. Another interesting factor was that the daughters from sick cows, they also had higher pregnancy loss. So we don't really know what happens, but there may be something related to development of the uterus or something like that, or maybe some immune factor that affect the pregnancy on those animals. And that's true since as a heifer, they already have a higher pregnancy loss before they calve for the first time. They have higher pregnancy loss. That was pretty interesting findings, although we couldn't give them many answers. It's more kind of a speculation, but we found that pretty interesting. But then we looked specifically on disease, and we know there's several other factors. So for example, heat stress, we know, I mean, although I'm pretty sure I'm talking a lot to people in the more northern part of the US, and I'm in Canada. I find that Canada is pretty cold compared to Brazil. But back home, you used to worry a lot about heat stress, and it's a problem in a lot of parts, pretty much every part in the world. There's some time that are going to have some heat stress, especially in the southern US. I was in Florida for a few months, and boy, it gets hot there, and the cows really suffer about it. So we know it's very well described that all the negative effects in performance, in behavior, in metabolism, feed intake, pretty much everything get impaired. And I would say it's the same with us. If put you to work very hard under the sun, you're gonna suffer, right? You won't produce as much. And normally all the studies used to do was look at the cows that were milking, like what happened to them. But then some years ago, like about 10 years ago, they started studying specifically around the breeding period, what happens. So the main findings is that there's a lower fertility. The cows that suffer heat stress, they have lower fertility, but then the calves, they may be affected. So some have a theory that calf that develops in a hotter environment, a uterine environment, they have more resistance to heat. That may be true, but maybe not. But there's some preliminary studies showing that these animals are actually performing worse. The animals born from mothers that had heat stress from the moment of the breeding, that conceived, those calves, they have a little bit worse performance. But still, it's there's a lot of environmental effects in there, so it's hard to really tell. But some studies, mainly from a group in Florida, they started to study the heat stress specifically in the dry period close to calving. So that's let's say 60 days, 45 days before calving, and they would leave a group on heat stress and the other one they would cool. And they're still finding some interesting aspects that it worth talking about it. So I worked a lot with repro in my master's, and we know that the heat stress can affect pretty much all the development of the embryo. So since before embryo is an embryo, when the oocyte is still developing, there's some studies specifically with IVF and embryo transfer that they show that there's some impairment already in the oocyte. And then once that oocyte is fecundated, you have the initial stage of development of the embryo. And we have a lot of studies that have shown that, yes, since they start, those embryos have worse quality. They develop slower, and they just don't, they're not as vigorous as the embryos from healthy cows, from cows that are not suffering from heat stress. So we know that there's, right from the start, there's impaired development, and that leads to higher losses. So, again, what happens to those that still survive, right? That are not in an ideal environment. So some studies, more specifically on dry period distress, heat stress, they have shown that, in fact, that the cows that are heat stressed just in that end period, they have shorter gestation. That leads to lighter calves, which is sort of expected. The cows get more stress, they get more cortisol, so they end up calving earlier, and the calves are lighter. The calves, they actually have reduced their organ size, they have reduced herds, and reduced spleen as well. And they have lower immune responsiveness, and they have higher stress markers. So right from the start, the calves are already more stressed, like their metabolic the metabolic system is already impaired and they can't respond to disease as well. But they also found that there's a reduced colostrum absorption on those calves that are heat stressed in the end of their development in the uterus. And they also have reduced feed intake, and they absorb have a worse absorption of the feed. So no matter, even if they were eating the same, they absorb less the nutrients. And then they followed those heifers, and they found that there's actually a worse development of the mammary system. The mammary gland doesn't develop as well. And that leads to lower production in their first lactation. So pretty much they followed these calves, let's say, from the time that they were in the uterus in the dry period, and they follow until the end of the first lactation. They found that they actually have lower milk production through their first lactation, probably related to the mammary gland development. So not only the milking side effect of heat stress, the production in the cows, we know that there's an issue if you leave your cows in the dry period in heat stress, and that carries over the progeny, the heifer that's going to be your future milking cow. And the other factor is nutritional factors. In dairy cattle, we don't have as many studies because we know that it's hard the cows are bred when they're milking, right? So you can't manipulate as much the diet. Pretty much by the time they're conceiving, they're having a lactating cow diet, and that's focused on production and making sure that they get enough nutrients to produce well. So it's a little bit limited. There's more studies in beef cattle looking in different sources and different levels of protein and energy. That in fact it does play a role in terms of normally they look on the carcass yield and fat deposition and marbling. And in fact, there is difference. If you change your protein source and you change the amount of protein you're giving to the cows, it affects the progeny, how the progeny development, how they mature, and how they grow. But we know that in dairy cows, for example, if they're in undernutrition in their dry period, for example, or in the end of their lactation, the daughters have lower milk production. So a lot of times people get a very fat cow in the dry period, they cut their feed. That's not a good idea because that may have long-term consequence to the calf. The heifer born from that mother won't produce as well, won't develop as well. And there's some studies that also looked in the body condition by the end of the pregnancy, and they found that moderate to high body condition score, the daughters have better reproduction, although they're slightly lighter. Just keep in mind here that they really looked on compared skinny cows are like under 3 or under 325 by the end of by the dry period. And they compare to cows that are, say, more normal, 325 or higher. But at the same time, one study, they looked at very pretty much obese cows. They were like 4, body condition score of 4 or higher. And they found that the calves were considerably smaller. Probably it may even be kind of a space thing. You have more fat deposition, so the uterus can't expand as much, so the calf end up developing not as well, and they are lighter. So I think that here the message is more trying to find the halfway through. Let's say a moderate body condition score, I think, would be the ideal. We know that you don't want a very skinny cow, but you don't want them to have very high body condition score as well. And more recently, we have seen some groups studying feed additives. It's still very preliminary. There's not many studies around yet. We know that methionine has been recently studied, as well as some other additives, specific organic source of minerals. And apparently there's some evidence that methionine has some positive effects on the calves. The calves end up having a little bit better immune response, and they are a little bit more vigorous since from the start. and they can absorb colostrum a little bit better. But it still is very preliminary. I think this type of study, I mean, methionine is something that has been more thoroughly studied over the last few years. But I think more and more there's an opportunity there with different feed additives, maybe additives that help cows cooling, get cooler, cooling off better, and other additives that may help improving the development in the end of maybe even during the period of the lactation, but also in the end of the gestation, by the time that we're in the close-up pen or something like that. But yeah, I believe more and more we're going to see more care in your dry period. Like, make sure you give some extra additives even during the dry period, as a time we try to save some money. But it may not be the case. It may be a good idea to make some investment there too. So talking a lot about the maternal effects, but we also know that the early life of the calves, they play an important role for the future. But a lot of times it kind of, everything goes under the colostrum. So I won't stress too much here. I'm pretty sure everybody knows very well. Colostrum is the most important thing for a calf, no matter what. But we also know that there's other factors, like just giving a great colostrum won't make our calf the best. You have to worry about the environment, the rest of the environment as well. So there's some studies with heat and cold stress in calves, and especially earlier life calves, like newborn calves. It does influence the colostrum absorption and the early growth of the colostrum. So not only the mother has the heat stress, but as the calf is born, it's important to make sure that they are in a good environment. And we often see, like especially here in Canada in the winter, sometimes the calves are born outside and middle of pack of snow, and it's not great. It's not great from the calf right from the start, and they suffer. It may be that loss that you don't really see, and takes a long time to really see how much that is affecting the calf. But we know that there is some impairment in their development, and they're going to end up producing a little bit less milk in their first lactation. So keep in mind that what looks like an expense, normally it can turn into a good return over the investment in the future. So making sure our calves are very well fed, they are in a good environment throughout their early life, it's crucial. And the studies with those maternal effects, a lot of times they talk about plasticity, development plasticity. Pretty much is how you can, with the same DNA, how much you can change the performance of the animals. You can mold the performance of the animal in the future. And we know that the earlier life, you have more plasticity. So that, again, comes to the colostrum aspect. It's very important to make sure that the calves get the best environment, the best colostrum, the best care right from the start, and not like don't underlook at them anytime. Like make sure that they get good care until they calf for the first time. So how can I minimize the negative effects of maternal effects, the negative factors of maternal effects? So a good transition means good lactations and healthy calves, no matter what. I think everybody knows the importance of transition period. It's not the focus here, but maybe we have to start thinking that is not only the transition period the time to invest, maybe the dry period is already, it's not a time to save money, to try to save money to spend in the transition. We know that, keeping the cows cool, it's very important. There's a lot of studies already showing that. It's very important to keep the cows comfortable, heifers comfortable, make sure that you're giving the best environment for our calves, for our cows, for our heifers, and keep our nutrition standard. So normally we see that great diet for the lactating cows, like super well balanced, the best additives and everything to make sure that the cows perform well. And then, that leftover hay that you can't even call hay, you give the heifers. So, it may not be the best strategy. We know that it costs a lot and feed's expensive, especially these days. But make sure that you produce good feed for all class of animals, no matter what. Make sure your calves, your heifers, your dry cows, they all get very high quality feed. And I mean, as I said, it's still very early, but it may be the case that in a few years, you're going to be worrying way more about the diet during the dry period for the growing heifers. And to wrap it up, some take-home messages: make sure that the environment of your animals, the environment that they are, is not holding their genetics back. So we see a lot of herds invest a lot in genetics. You find the best high index bull, and really put effort to improve your herd. But there's a lot of cases that the environment is holding them back, and some small tweaks that you can do, it can play an important role. And it's one factor here, one factor there, and by the end of the day, you can improve 200, 300 kilos in the first lactation cow. And that has if you think one cow, it's like, okay, it's not as much. But if you think in a group of 100 heifers, 200 heifers, 500 heifers that calve that year, you are talking about a few $1,000s. So, some small tweaks may have a very important, a very relevant impactor in the first lactation and their lifetime. And do not forget about your females during any time of their lives. It's very common to get to a barn, you see that new barn, awesome, the cows are doing great. But then, the heifers went to the old barn, and the old barn is falling apart, and it's hot and humid. And, you can tell that the heifers are not doing that great. And the same for the dry period, right? Like, I think more and more we're seeing farms investing in a good transition period. And I think that dry period, it doesn't matter if it's close up or far off, do good investment in your dry cows that they're gonna pay you back for sure. And it's really about thinking the long term. It's hard to think, I'm gonna have to care about this calf that's not even born, and they're gonna start to pay you back in 2.5 years. But I think more and more we're going towards a sort of a poultry industry that pretty much it's all not standard, but pretty much all very close to standard in terms of nutrition, in terms of environment, in terms of comfort. I think we have a lot to learn from them. We can start to make sure that every single part of our heifers' life, our cow's life, it's very well taken care, and that really pays back. That can really boost your production, the performance of your females, and by the end of the day, it's gonna pay you back. They're gonna produce more and give you more profit. So thanks a lot. I hope I could make a little bit of confusion to some and answer some questions. And please feel free to ask anything, and as much as we can, I'll try to answer. And thanks a lot.
Thank you, Murilo. That was great. Really, really interesting. And I think it sets the series up perfectly, because when Lindsay, Betsy, and I were talking about what we wanted to accomplish, it was exactly that as soon as those calves are weaned, sometimes it seems like anyways, they're getting pushed off to the side, shoved in housing that may be less than ideal. So I think you did a really good job of highlighting the importance of taking care of heifers throughout their entire life. So thank you for that. And if anyone has questions, please put them in the question and answer box and we will get to them. And I guess while we wait for some questions to come in, I can kick it off with a question for you, Murilo, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
So you were talking about the body condition score in the dry period. Do you know, or has anyone looked at the loss or gain in body condition as opposed to just the body condition score at the end of the dry period?
Yeah, I have seen one study that they did that. They didn't really find much, because the cows that were obese, that they lost some weight, they lost body condition score, but wasn't really enough to really drop to a skinny cow level, or a cow that's normally already skinny, they didn't really gain much body condition score. So although they looked into that, the gain wasn't that significant, and they didn't really find any difference in the calves. And I guess also harder to manipulate that, right? It's way harder to play with that and follow the calves in later life. So, but we know that changing body condition score for the lactating cow is not good, right? It's not ideal. I think more and more we're trying to strive a kind of same body condition score through their life. But yeah, in the calves, I don't think there's much studies or nothing really showing how the change plays a role.
Okay, thank you. So we do have one question that came in. Any follow-up on compromised heifers reaching their genetic potential in later lactations? Do they snap out of it, or are they compromised for life?
So for the disease study, I didn't look further in their lactations because the numbers start to reduce and reduce. So it's a little bit hard to keep following them. But I know that the guys in Florida, that did a study with heat stress, they are looking second lactation of those animals, and they keep producing a little bit less. I won't tell you the numbers from the top of my head, but it kind of carries over their life. So I think they're looking at the granddaughters now. I'm not sure if they have studies published so far, but I know that they were looking at the granddaughters. But yeah, they show that you have an impairment in the mammary gland development, so that very likely carries over at least at some level through their life. Great question, actually.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I had one too, Murilo.
Go ahead.
It's kind of, so I've listened to Dr. Mike Van Amberg talk from Cornell at several calf conferences. I mean, we've all listened to him, and he talks about how calves are born with their genetic potential, and it's the things we do to them over time that, erode at what her potential will be. And so I guess my question is, if we have to screw up at some point in her life, when do we do that? I don't want my farms to do anything less than perfect, but I mean, reality is that. So I guess the time that we want to overcrowd them or give them not the most perfect scenario, when would that be? Or you can answer it the other way of when do we absolutely have to get things right?
I think the most critical is the beginning of their life. I think that's where you have to be more careful, because that will easily carry over to their life. And I think so many studies we have with colostrum shows that very well. So, and I believe that extends to pretty much everything in their environment, not only the colostrum part. And I guess at the end of as they're getting to the dry period, to the prepartum period, I think that those are the most critical, because you're getting the cow set, but you're also caring about the calf, right? You're caring about two females in your herd, so I think is not a good time to screw up. But I mean, in general, we normally say, as Casey mentioned, we win the calves and forget about them a lot of times. But I don't. Especially during the transitions, I think that's a very critical period that, we're introducing stress to the animals, so they get more prone to get sick, and so many other physiological aspects that are going to be changing. So, I mean, I would say early life, but try not to screw up anytime if that's possible.
I'm glad we agree.
Okay. I have another question for you. Has any research looked at how disease during pregnancy impacts not some colostrum quality, but not so much like a Brooks reading, but like more of like the core components of colostrum, like the IgG levels and I guess overall colostrum quality.
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't studied much the colostrum part, but I know that there's some studies with transition periods, specifically more like closer to, let's say, the production of the colostrum. And yeah, it does affect like any sort of disease, and both the quality and the amount of colostrum that the cows are gonna produce. But I haven't looked really, by the beginning of the because I mean you have the lactation factor, right? By a good time of the pregnancy. So, but yeah, for sure during the dry period we know that it does affect the colostrum quality.
Thank you.
I'm not a colostrum specialist by any means, okay? So, yeah, I know that there's a role, but yeah, it was a very broad answer.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions remaining, please feel free to put them in the chat. And in the meantime, I'm gonna pass it back to Lindsay just to go over a couple of important things for the rest of the series.
Thank you. So thanks, Murilo. That was awesome. Like you said, I think that really sets us up for the next session, talking about the transition after weaning, and then moving forward all the way up to pre-calving. So this is just a reminder what we have coming up next week. Casey and I will be presenting on nutrition management and housing for those transition calves after weaning. And just as a reminder again, if my slides will advance, thank you to our sponsors, making this possible for us to offer this at no charge to our participants. And also as a reminder, when you close out of Zoom today, you should have a survey link automatically pop up. So if you wouldn't mind just filling that out, just to provide us with some feedback, it'll pop up after each session. So you'll get to do it a few times if you come each week. So thank you again, and hopefully we will see you next week. And again, thank you to Murilo for a great presentation.